Well, that was because I think my brother was extremely fond of motorbiking, and I was deeply envious of him, and I spent all my time in the stables helping to pull the bike to pieces, and he was very keen on racing them. And Colonel Cary Elwes, who was very much senior, of course, to both of us, said to my father, you know, it's very mean that you don't let that girl have a motorbike herself, because she's born mechanic and she's terribly keen, and I think you should give her one. And my father, to his, I must say, for that era, was very open-minded. He said, yes, why not, and gave me a motorbike. So that's how I started with that. My mother was deeply opposed, but my father said, no, but why not? She's keen on mechanics, and it's very good for her. And when war broke out, I was very anxious, obviously, to do what I could, and I had the offer to go up to London and join the Women's Emergency Corps. And so I went to my parents and suggested that was what I would like to do. My father said, well, you've got your head screwed on all right. And I'm not opposed to it. I think it's very natural for any young person to wish to do what they can in the circumstances. My mother was terribly opposed. And they started a very fierce argument on the suitability or otherwise. And meantime, I went upstairs and collected some underclothes and things in a big handkerchief. My mother said, I will on no account give her anything to take things away with her. And I rode up to London.
On your bike?
On my bike. And went to the Women's Emergency Corps, which was situated in the Little Theatre in the Strand in London, and asked if they'd like us to have a dispatch rider. And there I started. But let it be said that the Women's Emergency Corps was a remarkable, it was entirely manned by women, if you might say, by suffragettes, and who at once called off all their campaign, put themselves at the disposition of the government, and said, if you want any women to do any particular thing, we've got masses listed all over the British Isles, and we think we can produce pretty well everything you want. And it was while I was writing for them that Dr. Hector Munro, who was then organising the flying ambulance column to Belgium, saw me riding in London, and my motorbike was a stripped racing motorbike with dropped handlebars. And I think he was very deeply impressed with my ability to ride through the traffic. He traced me to the Women's Emergency Corps and saw Mrs. Haverfield and asked to see me, and he then said, would you like to go to Flanders? And I said, yes, I'd love to. And that's how it started. And I thought, he took 4 women, and the thing was, he was a great feminist in a time when, of course, that wasn't popular amongst men. And he felt that women should have a more say in things, and he wanted to prove that he could take 4 women onto the battlefields and they would not fail. They would stand up to it. And so he selected 4, of which 1 was an American. And he said he wanted to show America that if they were not coming at the war, one of their women could cover herself with glory.
Amazing. What was her name?
Helen Gleason. And her husband was a freelance journalist, American journalist, and he was out in Flanders already, and she naturally was anxious to get there too, and so he chose Lady Dorothy Fielding, one of the daughters of the Earl of Denbigh, myself and Mrs. Knockhart and Helen Gleason, Mrs. Gleason. And of course a whole male outfit too, 4 doctors and 2 men drivers and 2 ambulances, and we went off. But we got out, and just about the sacking of Louvain and Termonde, and we were quartered in Ghent, and we went out to all the battlefields immediately around Ghent. In fact, Mrs. Knocker and I were walking along a road one day, and we saw a sentry lying in the ditch, and we thought, well, that's very curious, we must be walking past the last of the Belgian lines. And so we said to each other, well, what does one do now? Because obviously we've gone a bit beyond where we should have gone. So I remember saying, well, let's go on and then turn round at that corner. And as we went still towards what must be the German lines, a car came along with 3 German officers fully plumed in their helmets and drove straight towards the Belgian lines, looked at us very closely and went on. So I remember Gypsy and I turned to each other and said, well, that's very peculiar, they're driving straight into the Belgian lines. Well, next thing we heard was machine gun fire, rifle fire opened up, and we turned round, went back, and of course these wretched Germans had really copped it, but one of them was only wounded, and he said, well, we saw 2 women walking, and we thought, well, we can't be into the Belgian lines yet, and they got the lot.
Good heavens.
Do you see, it was like that. You didn't know where the Germans were.
And they didn't
And
really know where
they didn't know where we were. And the whole of that war movement was that you never knew where the other fellow was. And we were twice involved in bayonet charges because we were right at the very front of the thing. First bayonet charge was in Mel, and we heard the clash of steel and we hid behind a ruined wall until it was over, and then had to clear up the situation, which is quite the nastiest because the Germans had right at the sheath end of the bayonet, by the hilt, a saw, which was put there so that in the trenches they could cut up bits of wood and that sort of thing, but I can't tell you what it was like when they put it through somebody's innards. And the result on that particular battlefield, bayonet charge, was very disagreeable, very, very nasty. And then at the Battle of Dixmude, where we were trying to hold the Germans back. Dixmude was just north of Ypres, and it was the Newport-Ypres line where the last stand on the Yser came. We were in another bayonet charge, just hiding alongside it. I think that is quite one of the most disagreeable forms of wounding. But after that, of course, it became more a fixed line, and Mrs. Knocker was tremendously impressed by the fact that so many wounded were dying in the ambulances coming back. And she said, if I could only get at these fellows early on, I could save a lot of them. They're dying of shock, and much more than from their wounds. And she's turned to me and said, now, would you follow me up if we went up the trenches tonight and stayed up there? And I said, oh yes, rather. And I know we filled our knapsacks and things with such as we required at that moment, and walked up with the soldiers. I suppose we must have marched about 10 kilometres up into the trenches in the pitch dark on the pavé roads, and we installed ourselves up there, and that in the cellar house.
That was at Pervyse.
At Pervyse. And Pervyse, of course, there had been a great battle there, and they caught the Germans in the floods, and it was full of dead bodies. And an unfortunate marooned bull.
Good heavens.
Yes, right in the middle of the floods, which we got a sniper to kill. But from that moment, of course, it became a static war on the trench line.
And that was when you
That's
arrived
when
at
we
Pervyse.
decided we would stay there. First of all, of course, the authorities said we they'd starve us out because we couldn't stay up there, you see. But due to the Baroness's extraordinarily fine work with the wounded, they gave permission. The King said, yes, we must stay because we were doing such good work.
So it was the King's own personal permission,
Yes,
really?
King's own personal permission. He came up to see us and was deeply impressed in what had been done to save the men right at the very moment they were hit. So after that we stayed up there, and then of course the British came up in 1917 and the whole place behind us was stiff with British howitzers. But from that it went on to day-to-day work. I suppose we worked a lot too for the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps, which were behind us. And they used to, unfortunately, be brought down into no man's land, and we used to have to make expeditions to try to get the pilots out.
You actually went into no man's land yourself?
Yes, ourselves.
On
And
foot?
that's where we got the military medal, you see. It was really for our work getting hold of these pilots who came down in front of the trenches.
Did you cross on foot? I mean, did you go
They
with
went
stretchers?
on foot. On foot, yes.
Just the two of you?
Yes.
With stretchers?
Not always with stretchers, just hoping to be able to get the arms round our necks. In fact, I bent a valve in my heart by humping men on my back. I was immensely strong, although I'm small, I was extraordinarily strong physically, and I could do that and heave somebody onto my back and carry them.
Goodness, if he was wounded, I mean, he must have been a dead weight.
Oh, dead weight, yes, dead weight. But, on occasion, of course, you see, the ambulances, as far as the Belgian army was concerned, the ambulances were 3 miles behind us. They weren't allowed to be situated so close to the trenches, but we actually kept an ambulance up at our post, hidden in a sandbag shelter of its own. And so that we had one available on the spot. And I used to take that ambulance out and drive the length behind the trenches sometimes to get some people out. And it was exactly like being like a grouse or something, because the Germans would get it, and I'd stop like this, and then I'd start like this. You know, it was absolutely a case of trying to get through, and always changing your timing.
And did you ever have to leave the ambulance? I mean, was there ever such
No, I know the ambulances, although they had shots through this Lamer I spoke of, who was an orderly, he always came with me. He was a wonderful fellow, a most inspiring companion. And we used to laugh like anything. We say, well, they didn't get us that time, Lamer. We'll dodge them yet. You know how it is when you're young. You
it was
just,
a game, was it?
Well, it was a game. You don't think of death when you're young. You know, it's not with you. But I had some wonderful affairs with that fellow, getting people out of strange places. You had to drive in the pitch dark. No lights whatsoever from the trenches. And if you can imagine to yourself pavé roads with deep mud both sides, troops coming up, guns coming up, shouts and yells to mind yourself, and then a most appalling slither as the ambulance slid off the pavé into the mud, and every one of the wounded at the back of you screaming, and bangs on the canvas on my back. For God's sake, can't you realize how we're suffering? And then, of course, as the troops came past, I called to them, please help to push the ambulance back onto the road again, you see. And you drive so far with absolutely no lights. And then as you were going towards the hospital, you could put your lights on quicker. But coming back for a long way, you were driving in the pitch dark and an empty, and of course you had no shelter in front, I mean nothing like a windscreen or anything, and no electric lights, no electricity on the car at all. So if you wanted lights, you got out and struck a match and lit a carbide light. And hope to goodness it wasn't blocked at that moment, it would light, and perhaps driving rain and an awful wind. No, you had no electricity in the car then at all, you see. And every car you swung. You had no self-starters.
So every time you had to start the car again,
you had to swing her. And you swung her in the winter in solid cold and frost. And taking all your strength and all your power to turn her. And those old-fashioned cars were not what you might call very willing starters, a lot of them. In fact, some of them, you'd almost have to take the plugs out and hop them before they'd start. But that was the most punishing part, probably, was the swinging of these old ambulances. And then, of course, very, very small tires, which punctured very easily. Oh, and you had to have some mechanical knowledge. That was absolutely essential. Because if you had a breakdown, you had to get yourself out of it. But fortunately, I was always keen on mechanics, and so I had some idea of what to do. But it was a very tough life for people brought up in very different circumstances, of course. And we slept in our clothes. At one period in the war movement, I didn't have my clothes off for 3 weeks. And by the time my vest came off, I had to be dabbed with moisture, because my skin was coming away too. You see, your skin was delicate. We used to always washing and bathing and that sort of thing. And I never forget how horrible it was. But, oh no, we slept always in our clothes, because it was a lot of night work. You see, the patrols going out, and that into no man's land, and people being brought back. And of course, it came straight into our dugout. But, yes, it was 3.5 years.
It's a long time.
Yes, long time. I was only wounded once, and that was only contusion by a huge lump of shell. It was spent shell, and it knocked me on the shoulder. And another time, I had septicemia set in with a thing in my wrist, which walked up halfway up my arm, and I happened to be down driving down by the direction of Turin, and I called in on a couple of women who were doing civilian work down there, and there was an officer from the British Army who was up for me that day, and he said, "Excuse me, could I ask what's the matter?" My arm was in a sling. He said, "Could I ask what's the matter with your arm?" And I said, "Well, I had something done to my wrist here, and it doesn't seem to be going very well." She said, "Well, would you mind if I looked at it?" And he said, "My God," when he'd seen it, he said, "I think you're going to lose your arm." And he said, "Look, I'm going to ring through to the British lines. I'm going to ask for 48 hours leave, and I'm coming back to Paris with you, because if I possibly can, I'm going to save that arm of yours." Well, he opened it up and he tubed it, and he got this, to his honour and glory, he got the septicemia down, and he definitely saved my arm, but I was never off for a day on it. And I drove the ambulance with my arm strapped to me like that, and one hand.
But changing gear and everything?
Everything. Everything. Just shows what you do when you're young. I never pulled out, but I suppose my arm must have been in a sling for a fortnight. And I drove single-handed. which are important to everything, but some of the worst things that happened was the treatment of people who were burnt, because in those days burning was done by oil, and today it's known, of course, that's just about the worst thing you can do. In fact, you can drop them right into saline. Of course, that's what they learnt for the Air Force boys, dropping into the drink. But it was one of the best things for burns. But in those days, masses of things we did have been found to be the very worst thing we could do. But it's amazing how we succeeded in saving so many of them. But on the other hand, I remember spending a whole night up with lots of wounded coming in, and there was one boy very, very badly hit in the head, and the brain was emerging. And we had a discussion, and the Belgian doctor from the trenches with us, as to whether it was worth trying to do anything about this fellow. But the brain was damaged to the extent it would never be right, and there were masses of wounded coming in. They were most important because a lot of them was salvable. And what should we do? Because this fellow would probably go on just sort of breathing for a long time. And you know what we did? And that may sound very peculiar, but we just opened up everything, let the brain drop into a bucket. And that shows you what has to happen in certain circumstances. The ones that were valid, the ones that were savable, must be saved.
Well, I mean, there must have been so many decisions that you were faced
Oh,
with.
tremendous decisions, and some of the wounds were pathetic, because you knew what they were going back to, emasculated and things like that, you know. And you wondered so much when they got back and what lives were ahead of them. But we were Madonnas. We were dealing with a Catholic country, and they called us the Deux Madonnes de Paris. And we had, funnily enough, over the entrance to the Dairat, which was steel doors we got from over here, we had a little shrine thing, you see, and that's what they called, the soldiers called us the Two Madonnas of Paris. And they felt if they fell into our hands, you see, they had every possible chance. But it interested me very much because in the exhibition in the Scottish National Library at the time of the anniversary of the suffragettes, they exhibited some of my things, and I had given them a news cutting book. And I thought, I was enormously interested what they'd pick out to have open in the case, you see. And I thought, well, they'll probably have open a thing which says that owing to that all women were ordered back from the zone of operations, but an exception had been made in favour of Madame Notka and Mademoiselle Chisholm by virtue of services rendered. And I thought, well, that's for women, and this was a women's show, emancipation of women, is probably what they choose. And you know what they chose? A little poem from a French soldier to myself personally, The Sunshine of Your Smile. And that was written, the rest was written in French, but the title was The Sunshine of Your Smile. And I said, isn't that astounding that they chose that particular thing? And so I was thinking about this Frenchman, and I remembered quite well him coming in. And you know, this really shouldn't be recorded, I suppose, but he had the most ghastly boil between his buttocks, right in under. And I thought, well, to write a poem to me after my peering. You see, they used to go back into trenches with these terrible boils and things.
Those must have been amongst the worst things, actually.
And really, how some of those men stood it. They had the most dreadful boils right between their legs, you know. And I was supposed to be the boil expert. It was funny.